He received his PhD from Princeton University with a dissertation on the history of the doctrine of the Wahdat al-Wujud, the oneness of being. He is the translator and also the editor of the Fusus al-Ikram of Ibn Arabi, the Ringstones of Wisdom, and is currently working as editor and contributor for the Study Quran under the direction of Dr. Sayyid Hossein-Nas. Without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Channer Dagli.
Thank you, Patrick. Her difficulty stemmed from thinking about her own daily prayers and supplications to God, forehead on the ground or hands raised towards the heavens, and what it would be like to direct those prayers to Jesus. For any Muslim, the substance of prayer consists in gratitude for blessings received, repentance for wrongs committed, petitions for good in this world and in the hereafter, and of course glorification and remembrance. These pillars of prayer and devotion for the typical Muslim approach something like self-evidently good ideas, and they are uncomplicated and direct. My mother knew enough about Christianity to know there is this idea of the Trinity, and that it involves something about Jesus being the Son of God, or Jesus being God. And in her own mind, she put these ideas together with her own understanding of what makes prayer, prayer, and came up with that sincere question, do Christians pray to Jesus? What she said was hardly absent from my mind as I thought about how to approach writing a Muslim response or appreciation of Christian prayer. The answer I gave her then, and which I would still give now, is no. Christians do not pray to Jesus in the way that Muslims pray to God when they stand and bow for the Salah or raise their hands in supplication. Christians do not address in their prayers, O Trinity, nor do they say or believe, for example, that Jesus, as such, created the heavens and the earth. I told her that when Christians pray to God, they really are praying to God, to one God. But when Christians talk about God, they do say that He is triune and that Jesus is the Son of God and God incarnate. And to a Muslim, this is already and necessarily attention. For me, the answer to the general question, to whom do Christians pray, and by extension, how do Christians pray, is from the Muslim point of view, a complex one. The most important reason for this complexity is that the Quran, the basis for any Muslim's theological position, provides a picture of Christianity that is often misunderstood and which is more nuanced and complex than many commentators and theologians, both Muslims and Christian, seem to give it credit for. It is clear that the Quran does not render just one judgment about Christians, neither always condemning them nor always praising them. For example, if we were to ask what the Quran says about monks, we would come across verse 82 of Surah Al-Ma'idah, which reads, "And thou wilt find the nearest of them in affection towards those who believe to be those who say, we are Christians. That is because among them are priests and monks, and because they are not arrogant." But in Surah At-Tawbah, verse 34, we read, "O you who believe, verily many of the rabbis and monks consume the wealth of people falsely, and turn from the way of God. As for those who hoard gold and silver and spend it not in the way of God, give them glad tidings of a painful punishment." The complexity of the Quran's position on Christians is perhaps evidenced most clearly in a single verse regarding Christian monasticism, 57:27. "Then we sent our messengers to follow in their footsteps, and we sent Jesus, son of Mary, and we gave him the gospel and placed mercy and kindness in the hearts of those who follow him. And monasticism they invented. We did not ordain it for them, only to seek God's contentment. Yet they did not observe it with proper observance. So we gave those of them who believed their reward, yet many of them are iniquitous." This complexity comes out in the fact that 1, God characterizes followers of Christ as being kind and merciful. 2, notes that Christians themselves, not God, ordained monasticism. 3, monastic practice was originally well-intentioned, but somehow Christians were not faithful to it, or some weren't, by which some Muslim commentators understand the introduction of the Trinity and other doctrines. 4, there was a right way to be a monk, according to this Quranic verse. And 5, some of these who practice monasticism have a reward, while some are iniquitous. Finally, in light of all this, we read in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 62, and also in a similar verse elsewhere in the Quran, truly those who believe, and those who are Jews and the Christians and the Sabaeans, whosoever believes in God and the last day and works righteousness, shall have their reward with their Lord. No fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve. There are many more relevant passages of the Quran which I could cite, but for my purposes here, it is enough to say that I view all of the Quran statements about Christians in the framework of the Quran's description of sacred history, sectarian disagreement, and uncompromising monotheism, as variations of two underlying principles. First, that for Christians who believe in God and perform righteous deeds, no fear shall come upon them, nor shall they grieve, which is a description, you might say, equivalent to salvation in the Quran, when you see that phrase. And second, that Christians utter kufr, or unbelief or disbelief, when they say that Jesus was the Son of God or that he is God, and when they worship Jesus and Mary as gods. That is, I understand the Quran to be saying that the Christians worship well, but have terrible ideas. The challenge of approaching Christian worship and devotion is that these two principles, or axioms, as I perceive them, exist in a kind of tension. This basic distinction that the Quran makes in its treatment of Christians and Christianity, and which can serve as a reliable basis for which to compose a Muslim response to Christian prayer, is the difference between devotional attitudes on the one hand and metaphysical propositions on the other. It is the difference between how one encounters God and how one describes God. And the Quran generally praises Christians in their devotion to God, while generally condemning them for their theology. It is within this framework, this tension, that I would like to explore some aspects of Christian worship and prayer from the point of view of a Muslim believer. First, I'd like to talk about the sacraments. I would like to begin talking about the sacraments to show that distinguishing between what one might call the theological background and the devotional foreground can be helpful when thinking carefully about Islam and Christianity. It is usually said that Islam has no sacraments, but it certainly has rituals that seem to have some overlap with what would be called sacraments in the Christian context, if not in their precise form, then in the attitude or posture one takes in performing them. Muslims tend to conceptualize the Christian sacraments against the backdrop of a drastic distinction between the sacred and the profane, between what is spiritual and merely natural. This impression is often reinforced by the limited number of sacraments, which act as conduits of divine grace, and also by statements such as, "Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's." Also the Christian doctrine of original sin and the fall. And this impression is also exacerbated by the general absence of understanding by Muslims of the theological explanations of the sacraments. Moreover, there is a problem here of terminology. What are called sacraments in the West are in the East called mysteries, a more fluid term not restricted to the 7 sacraments, or depending on how you count them, but also including, for example, the incarnation itself. Indeed, posing a question using the word sacrament already has the potential to leave out too much and to lead to misunderstanding. The Christian sacraments, or sacred mysteries, operate within a universe that is determined by the Christian view of the fallen state of human beings and the special manner in which they stand in need of God's grace. And because Muslims conceive of this fallen state and its remedies differently, there is often an assumption made both by Muslims and Christians that Islam has no sacraments. Also, because there is no priesthood and no church hierarchy, and because sacraments are typically administered through them, though not always, again, the distinction and variety are too much to capture here. Muslims, again, will usually say that there are no sacraments in Islam and that Islam is not a sacramental religion. My contention is that a Muslim can have a more positive appreciation of the sacraments than is typically afforded by conceiving of sacraments as a distinctively Christian feature of religion. To be sure, there are decisive differences between the theological and metaphysical apparatus surrounding these acts of worship in Christianity and their counterparts within Islam. But I believe we can understand the similarities and differences in liturgy and ritual between the two religions if we do not insist on categories such as sacramental and non-sacramental. After all, Christians describe a sacrament or sacred mystery as consisting of 1, an outward sign or form, 2, an inward grace, and 3, that it's a divine institution, that it's instituted by God. This latter is crucial, that third, because it distinguishes mysteries of the special kind from the general mysteries of the world as God's creation expressing his wisdom and power. If we take that Christian definition of sacrament or sacred mystery and keep to these essentials, it turns out to be a decent, rough and ready description of the 5 pillars: canonical prayer, the fast, the pilgrimage, the zakat, or the alms. If one message comes out from reading the Quran, it is that everything God created is a sign, conveying a grace, we would say barakah, or blessing, some being natural and others most certainly being instituted specifically by God. When I reflect upon the central practices of Islam as sacraments, quote unquote, to my mind the description seems to fit, so long as we hold firm to the conception: 1, an outward sign; 2, having an inward blessing or grace; and 3, instituted by God. I know in my own spiritual universe what it is like for a believer to gravitate towards barakah, towards blessing or grace, and that believers automatically conceive of some kind of inward element in the rites, often thought of as a kind of angelic support that flows through the rites. I had actually in my paper quoted here the hadith which has been repeated many times this morning about the supererogatory prayer, so I'll skip that just for sake of time. My remarks about the sacraments are more of an appreciation than anything else, since time does not allow me to address each of them individually. What I would like to point out is that the specifically Christian notion of what it means to be fallen and the transformation these sacraments or mysteries are meant to effect seem to be a major part of what makes Christian sacraments opaque and well-nigh impenetrable to Muslims, and it may be part of what masks the spiritual ambiance of Islamic rites to Christians. That is to say, if we get too lost in the respective theologies and hierarchies, we can lose sight of the obvious similarities in that actual moment and experience of prayer and ritual. When an infant is baptized, or when a father recites the adhan into his newborn's ear, or when a Christian receives the Eucharist and a Muslim recites the Quran, holy orders and the bestowals of a Sufi cloak, not to mention the commonalities in matrimony, in the ceremony of matrimony. Now I'd like to turn to a brief discussion of the Lord's Prayer. Though I could have structured my entire talk as a Muslim response to the Lord's Prayer, I would like to focus on 2 aspects of it. The words, "Our Father," already seem to complicate the plain sense of Trinitarian doctrine, since Christ is not the Son of God the way Christ describes the believers as being sons and daughters of God in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." Commentators upon the Lord's Prayer, from Tertullian and Origen through Calvin and Luther, even to the Catholic Catechism, are placed in the position of elucidating how the "our" in "Our Father," when spoken by the believers, does not change the "my" of "my Father" when spoken by Christ. In reading these meditations and explanations of the Lord's Prayer, a Muslim reader such as myself is somewhat frustrated in not finding somewhat clearer solutions to the problem of equivocality when one encounters the word Father in the prayerful statement, "Our Father," and when one reads it in what might be called the metaphysical statement, "I and the Father are one," John chapter 10, verse 30. By equivocality, I mean that the word Father is not used univocally in these 2 instances, as when one says man of both Socrates and Plato, and neither is it a pure homonym, as when one speaks of the bank of money and the bank of the river. As they might say in Islamic philosophy, the relation between the 2 instances of the word Father lies between synonymy and homonymy, to use a rather awkward sounding word. In his commentary on the Quran, the theologian who was mentioned earlier, Fakhruddin Razi, notes that the appellation Father for Christians must have originally, well, from his point of view, must have originally denoted priority, authority, and love, not unlike the description of God as Lord or King. And on this score, he sees no irreconcilable problem with it. But in his view, it then became exaggerated to the point of being a theologically untenable limitation of God, being bound up with the Incarnation and the Trinity. It does seem significant to me that in this central prayer, taught to believers by Christ, the Father is the kind of Father even an Asherite theologian like Razi would be able to pray to. One feels a tension between the doctrine bound up in the phrase, God the Father, and the natural attitude expressed in the prayer, Our Father in heaven, or Our Father who art in heaven. So, by way of registering a Muslim puzzlement on the matter, when a believer says, Our Father in the Lord's Prayer, is it closer to the Father as Razi conceives of it, or is it closer to being the Father of the Nicene Creed? When one is actually praying, what does it actually mean to call God Father? Later in the Lord's Prayer, we find the petition, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. In a Muslim's mind, a prayer for forgiveness is a hope that God will consider one to be forgiven, that he will show compassion and mercy and will not take us to task for everything that we have done. A Muslim knows that for a Christian, forgiveness is bound up totally with Jesus' experience on the cross, but also beyond that with baptism, and furthermore is intimately related to concepts such as justification and sanctification. Taking all of this into account and trying to capture the spirit of my mother's original question, I would ask, when a Christian prays for forgiveness, what is he or she praying will happen? I formulate it in this way to highlight that from the outside looking in, the economy of forgiveness, of getting right with God, of being reconciled, however one formulates it, seems complex and difficult to capture in a single insight. For example, one has difficulty, again from the outside, in juxtaposing the direct, intuitive forgiveness that seems to be described and hoped for in the Lord's Prayer with the various versions of atonement, whether it be the ransom theory, penal substitution, and variations thereof. I am not here trying to decide or decode between these theories, but I'm trying to understand how, in the actual articulation of the Lord's Prayer and the petition for forgiveness, these theories, so intimately bound up with the central doctrines of the Trinity and the Incarnation, actually guide and provide substance to the supplication for forgiveness in that moment of worship. The analogy that is bound up in this petition, as we also have forgiven our debtors, announces to my mind a certain simplicity of act. I know what it is like to forgive another human being, and it does not seem, again from the outside, easily modeled on any of the mainstream theories of atonement. The plain sense of the Lord's Prayer strikes one as limpid and straightforward, providing a kind of commentary upon itself when it reads, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Often in the commentaries upon this particular verse of the Lord's Prayer, one is directed to Luke chapter 6, verse 37, forgive and you will be forgiven, and Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 to 22, then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. By way of conclusion, well, my penultimate conclusion, it is worth considering, in light of this discussion of Christian worship and devotion, some more significant Quranic passages related to Christian theology and devotion. First, there's 5:116. And when God said, O Jesus, Son of Mary, didst thou say unto mankind, take me and my mothers as gods besides God? And 5:73, they certainly disbelieve who say, truly God is the third of three, while there is no God save one God. I would not be the first to see the possibility that the statement, take me and my mothers as gods, does not have to be interpreted as some version of a doctrinal trinity, but as a subjective association of objects of worship with God. Still, it is commonly thought that somehow the Quran got the Trinity wrong here, or that this is referring to a long-dead sect that did in fact worship this Trinity of God, Jesus, and Mary. The same is often said of the statement, God is the third of three, again interpreted sometimes to be a misunderstanding, or perhaps a record of a way of describing Jesus that was common in Syriac at the time the Quran was revealed. To me, it is important to note that this verse critiques the assertion that God, not the Father, is the third of three. God is not the third of three for Christians. Rather, God is the three. I interpret God as the third of three, as I do the taking of Jesus and Mary as gods besides God. That is to say, as describing an attitude of worship that the Islamic perspective cannot accept. To my mind, one key to interpreting such verses has always been verse 31 of Surah At-Tawbah, 931. They have taken their rabbis and monks as lords apart from God, as well as the Messiah, son of Mary, though they were only commanded to worship one God. Now, no Christian theology places monks as objects of worship, and the grouping together of monks and Christ in this verse shows that what is at stake is an attitude, the orientation of the soul in the act of worship, not a matter of official theology. Is there any doubt that in the economy of Christian devotion there is a kind of devotional trinity of God, Jesus, and Mary, which is not coterminous with the doctrinal trinity of Father, Son, and Spirit? Who receives prayers and devotions in the Christian tradition if not these three, and in this order? From the Islamic perspective, when the veneration of Jesus and Mary go too far, God, and not the Father of the Trinity, becomes the third of three objects of worship. I favor reading these verses as being critiques of the actual devotional posture of some Christians, because elsewhere the Quran does provide a head-on critique of Christian theology. In 4:171, O people of the book, do not exaggerate in your religion, nor utter anything concerning God save the truth. Verily the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of God and his word that he committed to Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in God and his messengers, and say not three. Refrain, it is better for you. This is, to my mind, as direct an indication that the theology is at question, not the practice. The bare and unqualified command, say not three, does not implicate the devotional life of Christians or their acts of worship, drawing attention rather to what they say, not what they do, and does so in a remarkably gentle fashion, at least the doctrinal half of that verse. The issue at hand is that a mainstream Christian, the issue at hand from a Muslim point of view, for a Muslim response, is that a mainstream Christian does not view Trinitarian theology and Christology as theological afterthoughts to their encounter with God in prayer, to be toyed with in an armchair after the serious business is done. Rather, the Trinity is what God is, and one really cannot come to the Father but through the Son, who is God incarnate. A Muslim will wait in vain for the Christian to say that Father and Holy Spirit are just different names for God. They aren't. And this is what leaves Muslims often baffled when looking closely at both Christian ritual life and Christian doctrine together. It leads people like my mother to ask, do Christians pray to Jesus? To the Muslim soul, the actual encounter between a human being and God, the attitude of devotion, the resolve to a life of virtue, are realities which converge upon a unity that is not analyzable or divisible into a conceptual trinity. And the Christian Trinity is, no matter how it is formulated, a conceptual threeness, since the minimum definition has at least three ideas in it, and even more because their relation must also be taken into account. While Muslims famously attribute to God many names, these are attributes of one object. When I bring my attention upon another human being, my wife for example, with all her attributes and actions, I am conceiving of her as a single person with those attributes. But the hypostases are not attributes or names of a single essence. The three of the Trinity cannot be collapsed or transcended in mainstream Christian theology. And so the Muslim wonders how or whether a Christian addresses himself or herself to three persons in prayer, or to one of the three, and if so, how? When an activity becomes most human and spiritual and most alive, it converges on simplicity, the simplicity of the whole, not of the part. When we first play a musical instrument, we necessarily visualize our actions as a sequence of motions and as an aggregate of parts. When we achieve true mastery, this complexity becomes a simplicity. We no longer see 10 different fingers on white and black keys, each key with a separate name and sound. We see an inseparable whole. In prayer, from the Muslim point of view, the conceptual oneness we ascribe to the object of our worship can accompany us, as it were, along every level of prayer and contemplation, until we leave off the level of ideas into pure contemplation or silence. But a Muslim has difficulty, again from the outside, understanding how the conceptual non-unity of the Trinitarian idea becomes simple. That is, as we focus our attention and our heart upon God, does not the relationality of the three persons have to give way at some point to the immediacy and simplicity of the I-thou encounter in prayer? And if so, does it not behoove the supplicant or worshiper to begin and end simply with that thou, and to conceive of it as simply as is possible? Is there not a hiatus from the three elements in the mind to the unity of the lived encounter, to the oneness of the actually existing experience that happens in prayer? The Islamic attitude in prayer originates from the content and indeed the very form of the Shahada, the La ilaha illallah. As a matter of prayerful meditation or meditational prayer, the formula, no God but God, continuously wipes away all other objects of thought until one is left only with Allah. And as the Sufis would then say, the final H of the Allah, and finally just the breath, and then the death of the soul. The idea of one comes with us at each step of that spiritual journey, right up to the point where we cannot or should not any longer think our thoughts. But it seems from the outside, again, from the outside, that the Trinity as an idea in the mind, again, not as a reality that is encountered, cannot come so far with us. It must stay, in a sense, behind as the human being's consciousness of God becomes increasingly simple and integrated. Now, my actual conclusion. I am not here trying to solve any metaphysical puzzles or even to mount a critique of Christian theology from a Muslim perspective. Rather, I'm trying to convey what I think is a faithful Islamic response to and also appreciation of Christian worship. I base my reflections on what I think the Quran literally says about Christians, because I think that is the only legitimate starting point for a Muslim. My whole premise is that the Islamic attitude to this question is necessarily complex, because what the Quran says about Christians is not simple and is not lacking in nuance. And in reading what the Quran has to say, I have found it most helpful to make this basic distinction between what human beings actually do in their souls when they worship or pray, and the intellectual or symbolic framework within which they situate those actions. I am not trying to disentangle them, because they are inseparable, like the dimensions of breadth and depth, but they are not the same thing, and they often exist in a state of tension. They usually do, in fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dagli. Our second speaker is Father Daniel Madigan from the Society of Jesus. He is currently Jeanette and Otto Rusch Family Associate Professor of Theology at Georgetown University in Washington. And he has served as the community superior of the Woodstock Jesuit community in DC. He also taught at various academic institutions, such as the Pontifical Gregorian University, Ankara University, and the United Faculty of Theology of Melbourne. He received his PhD in Islamic religion from Columbia University. In his numerous publications, he has focused on Quranic studies and on Islamo-Christian theological issues and dialogue. His book, The Quran Self-Image, Writing and Authority in Islam's Scripture, was published by Princeton University Press in 2001. Dr. Madigan.
Thank you, Professor Laude. And let me add my thanks to SFS Qatar and to Archbishop Rowan for his invitation. It's been a great privilege over these last years to be part of this process and to be back in Qatar now, where we first met and embarked on this journey, is a joy. I'm kind of glad my task is not to respond to Jana's paper, because there are much better theologians than I am around here who may be able to help. my task is the mirror image of what he did. Whenever one talks about prayer, one is treading on holy ground, and that's particularly the case when one is speaking about other people's prayer. One has no access to that secret space in which God and the believer encounter one another most intimately. And there is certainly no question of making judgments. In this short paper, what I hope to do is to share some observations about my experience as a friend and admirer of Muslims who pray. These are insights that have been prompted by them, observations about things that seem to me to be common to us, and others that offer some contrast by which we can know who we are in our particularity and difference. I run an extra risk, of course, because I'm doing this before an audience that includes fellow Christians, and I run the risk that they might not recognize their understanding of prayer or their experience of it in what I say about mine. But let me risk both those things. It's a great pity, indeed a great injustice, that almost the only images of the Muslim ritual prayer seen by many people in the West are the accompaniment to television news reports of violence and radicalism. Those who lived through the violent decades of the Irish Troubles can imagine what the corrosive effect would have been if every report of an IRA attack had been illustrated by images of Catholics at Mass. One of the most striking aspects of the Muslim community at prayer, and this is probably why the images are so much used, is one of the most striking images of the aspects of the Muslim community at prayer is the communal prayer with its row upon row of believers standing shoulder to shoulder before God. Yet these prayer lines are straight only if we consider them on a micro level. The Ahl al-Qibla, or as Kenneth Cragg liked to translate it, the people of the point, are actually praying, he observed, not in serried ranks, but in enormous concentric circles, world-sized circles, all focused on the one point. The turning of one's face as a whole community towards a single point on the face of the earth 5 times daily is the physical analog of the constant spiritual reorientation that any believer needs. One repeatedly pauses to get one's bearings on the journey on which we are led by God. Those who pray are, in Quranic terms, the muhtadun, the ones who accept to be guided, rather than to choose proudly their own path and end up wandering, lost. I'm reminded here of an echo with Newman's Lead, Kindly Light. He loved to choose his own path. Pride ruled his will. I'm also reminded of Ignatius of Loyola. He gets another mention today, but why not? I'm also reminded of Ignatius Loyola's constant habit of the examen. This was not a regretful looking backwards at failure, but rather a taking of bearings and a new orientation towards companionship with Jesus. The point, Cragg called Muslims the people of the point on which we all focus, of course, is the point where we believe God has addressed his word to us in history. That's why for Muslims, the point is in Mecca. Indeed, having a qibla, having a direction of prayer, is a reminder that we're not simply devoting ourselves to a numinous, utterly transcendent real, a la John Hick, but to a God who has a word for us in our historical particularity. Christian prayer has its qibla in perhaps slightly different ways. It became a custom to orient churches toward the east, so the congregation would pray towards the rising sun as a symbol of the resurrection and of the awaited return of the Christ. In my own church, people argue about which way the priest should be facing during the Eucharist. He is said to be facing the people or to have his back to the people. But surely the point is that both the celebrant and the congregation are focused on our Qibla, our orientation point. The Eucharist we are celebrating in obedience to the command of the one who told us to remember him by breaking the bread and sharing the cup. He is our Qibla because his self-sacrificing is the point at which, in the Christian understanding, the divine word is most clearly expressed in our human history. The Muslim ritual prayer, the Salat, itself is carried out for the most part in silence, its physical rhythms measured by the praise of God. It's not a dialogue between a leader and a congregation, as much of Christian ritual can be, and it's not reliant on a clergy. It's very obvious in Muslim worship that those who participate are not spectators, but worshippers. And this is something which strikes me again and again, because one finds oneself in some Christian liturgies witnessing a move away from the assembly as worshippers, as co-celebrants of the liturgy, towards the assembly as a kind of audience. This can even happen in situations where there is a great deal of involvement of the people in various liturgical ministries, rendering the worship truly beautiful. It can lead to a sense of having the cast up on the sanctuary and the audience in the pews, especially when we do, as sometimes happens, terrible, it drives me crazy, we roll the credits at the end of the liturgy. We give a round of applause to the choir and to the organist, to the cantor, to the liturgy committee, and so on, as though there is anybody else to be thanked in the liturgy than God. Even when one person is praying alone, the Salat is physically dramatic. And in large assemblies, it's strikingly expressive of profound communal solidarity and faith. The postures are physically demanding, and in spite of their boldness, they don't seem to cause self-consciousness, as witness the almost casual way in which a lone Muslim might pray even in apparently very unpromising surroundings at a difficult time. This is a thing which often strikes Christians traveling in the Middle East and in other Muslim countries. The witness of the lone prayer. There is nothing, all the world, we are reminded by such people, is a mosque, literally, a place appropriate to the worship of God. And there is nothing more pressing, no power that cannot wait its turn for our attention behind the God who lays claim to it. Not only that, but all the world itself is at prayer. According to the verse quoted this morning by Dr. Dean Mohammed, Surah An-Nur, verse 41, all of creation knows its salat and is performing it constantly. So our own prayer, whether we are Muslims or Christians, is of a piece with the prayer, if we can call it that, of the rest of creation. This will recall to the Christian mind perhaps the canticle of the three young men in the fiery furnace that we get in at least some versions of the book of Daniel, or Psalm 19. Let me read you a few lines just to give you the flavor of it. The three young men in the fiery furnace are praising God, and having blessed God in their various ways, they call upon the rest of creation, saying, "Bless the Lord, all you works of the Lord. Praise and exalt him above all forever. Angels of the Lord, bless the Lord. Praise and exalt him above all forever. You heavens, bless the Lord," etc. "All you waters of the heavens, bless the Lord. All you hosts of the Lord. Every shower and dew, all you winds, fire and heat, dew and rain, frost and chill, ice and snow, nights and days, light and darkness. All these things are called upon to bless the Lord." These robust gestures of Muslim prayer, the profound prostrations, and the expressiveness of its postures, are often in contrast, I find, with many Christian rituals in which movement and gesture have been reduced to an embarrassed minimum, the involvement of the body sacrificed, as it were, to an ever greater reliance on words to substitute for and explain symbols that have now become so vestigial that they can no longer speak for themselves. With the possible exception of the Friday sermon, Muslim worship is non-clerical. The obligation to perform this ritual 5 times a day is incumbent upon the individual, whether there is a community and a leader or not. One witnesses among those Muslims who fulfill the obligation a striking sense of individual responsibility, even if the time and place are less than ideal. The imam, literally the person in front, is the facilitator of the community's common worship in the most minimal way. Virtually anyone who knows what he's doing can perform the role. He performs the same actions as the other worshippers and says the same words, just setting the pace and giving the audible cues for those ranged behind him. This always strikes a Christian, I think. We're used to something different. In my own Roman Catholic tradition, even though with the decline in the number of men who feel called to the celibacy currently required for ordination to the priesthood, there is an increase in the number of communities that are taking responsibility for their own life of common worship. There is still a sense that such responsibility is somehow exceptional rather than fundamental, and it could scarcely be considered obligatory. No priest, no mass, no obligation. How different a sense one gets from a Muslim for whom constant attention throughout the day to time and space is required for maintaining the ritual prayer. Seeing as I've allowed gender to rear its head in the previous paragraph, let me acknowledge how striking it is to see the robust masculinity of Muslim public prayer. One realizes straight away that the Salat is a political act in the broadest and most positive sense of that word. That is to say, it's an act of the polis, of the citizenry, together. So to participate, particularly in the Jummah prayer, is to take one's place in public life. Is this why, I wonder, it is so intriguing to a Christian to see, for example, 2 or 3 college-age students going matter-of-factly to the mosque together for Salat in the course of an otherwise normal day? For many Christians, a visit to a church out of hours, or even on a Sunday, might seem to be a public demonstration, perhaps edifying, maybe puzzling, perhaps even unwelcome, a public demonstration of an interior life that would normally be kept private. One can't help but applaud this lively sense of the connection between our life of faith, our orientation to God in prayer, and our public political responsibility. At the same time, noting this masculinity, we note the relegation of women to a position out of sight, where they'll not prove an immodest distraction to the ever-susceptible male. This relegation offers a dramatic demonstration of a de facto exclusion from public life. Even though the obligation to pray is also incumbent on women, one witnesses a hesitancy to allow the same connection between faith and public life in their case as one sees celebrated in the male case. Of course, as a Roman Catholic, I'm hardly in a position to throw stones here. Seeing such exclusion in an unfamiliar setting alerts me further to the ways in which women are excluded in so many ways from worship in my tradition, even more so de facto than might be required de jure. In most parts of the world, the involvement of women in the liturgical ministries currently open to them lags well behind the law that allows it. And even more striking in both our traditions than the exclusion, or at least the dissuasion from full participation in worship, is the resistance to women's leadership and governance. Before I dig myself in too deeply here, let me change the subject. Change the subject to memory and remembering, terms central to both our traditions of prayer. We heard a wonderful presentation this morning about dhikr from Dr. Shah Kazmi, and we also heard the importance of it from Dr. Deen Mohammed. For a Christian, the Muslim notion of dhikr bears many echoes. The Eucharist, our central act of worship, is explicitly an act of recalling, anamnesis, and not simply the recalling of information. It is a reliving and entering once more into the reality of those events of Christ's death and resurrection. It's also a prayer for God to remember us, and thus a mutual remembering in which we count on God's promise spoken through the prophet Isaiah that even though, heaven forbid, a nursing mother should forget her baby at the breast, God would not abandon us. The mutuality of remembering is also closely related to a mutuality of hearing, sama'. Our scriptures, though of course they underline God as a speaker of the word, repeatedly remind us that God is also a listener. God hears the cry of the poor, the prayer of the just, the blood of the slain Abel crying out for justice. And God quotes against us the things he has heard us say. Yet God has less need to listen than we do, and we risk so filling our prayer with our empty-headed words that we are unable to hear the word addressed to us. It is the word addressed to us which, we believe, each in our own way, creates us and recreates or saves us. The words of salat, also of dhikr, are by and large Quranic words. That is to say that for the believer they are God's words. And perhaps paradoxically, it is the word that has been given to us, not the one that we imagine we have produced or invented, that is our appropriate response to God. So many of the practices of Muslim prayer remind us that it is the divine word given to us that is our point of contact, our way of return, if you like, to the God who speaks. God's word draws us to God's self. By resonating with the sound, the energy of God's speech, particularly what God says of God's self, the believer is brought near to God. For Christians, of course, the word is expressed in our history in flesh and blood rather than in words. Our resonating with the word will be, as Archbishop Rowan put it in his reflection on his own prayer, an allowing of ourselves to be drawn into the stream of self-giving that flows from Jesus to the Father. Just a few comments on praying together, because my experience of being an admirer of Muslims at prayer has raised similar questions to the ones that were posed this morning. St. John, in his first letter, asks us rather pointedly how we can claim to love the God we cannot see when we do not love the brother or sister we do see. A disunited worship will always be an incomplete worship because it bespeaks an as yet imperfect love of one another. So a united worship ultimately is an objective that we have to work towards. Still, it may be that this connection between the love of the other and the true worship of God, that in this connection lies the answer to our difficulty about common prayer. Recognizing the creature will draw us to worship the Creator, so we begin with the recognition of the creature, perhaps in ritualized form, but even more basically and more importantly in non-ritual activity, which might eventually find its way into ritual and explicit worship. So rather thinking that if we could just worship in common, we would come to love one another, what I'm suggesting is that we should pursue first the ordinary experience of a deepening affection and respect, and then a desire for and a sense of common worship will naturally emerge from that. Let me give you an example. Some years ago, when I was still teaching in Rome, I was at a seminar in Istanbul, the New Rome. One of my Muslim students was there, and she invited me and two other professors, who also happened to be rabbis, and the wife of one of them, to visit her family. We sat under the trees outside their small summer house on the Anatolian side of the Bosphorus, picking cherries and mulberries as we chatted using the various languages and translations we could manage to muster among the 8 of us. It was unavoidable that we would talk about religion, at least part of the time, because the father of the family was a retired high school religion teacher. Never having had a rabbi in his house before, let alone 2 at once, he could not miss the opportunity to ask about various things that had puzzled him over the years. The honest courtesy of his inquiries, the warmth of the hospitality, and the unostentatious care taken to ensure that the meal could be readily shared by all, combined to make that evening truly memorable. At the end of the meal, Betul's father invited the 3 Jews present to pray the grace. When they had done so, my student asked me to sing the Tese Magnificat that is used as a prayer after meals in the Christian community where she was living in Rome at the time. The family followed this with their own prayer in Arabic. For all of us, it was a moment of profound gratitude for a rare glimpse of unity among believers. However, it was a moment long prepared by studying together, by simple contacts in the university, by years spent by all parties in trying to understand the tradition of another or the others. That small, unrehearsed liturgical moment that seemed so perfectly to express the reality of our friendship as believers of related but diverse traditions was the goal towards which we strive, not the point from which we begin. We could sense in one another at the end of that evening a genuine desire to worship, to give thanks. It was, in the literal sense of the word, a Eucharistic moment. If our interreligious worship is to have any sense as praise and thanksgiving, then it probably has to come after the simple living and working together in which we discover a motive for gratitude and a desire to praise the God who made all this and brought us together in human solidarity. To conclude, I just want to offer, well, I'm going to use George Herbert again. This will be 3 times for Ignatius, 3 times for George Herbert, but they're both good men. Professor Abdul Halim would probably want a woman quoted. We had women quoted this morning. Thank you, Michael. The simplicity and the dramatic directness of Muslim ritual prayer that I've been speaking about, its eloquent embodying of humble submission to God, are surely attractive to the Christian. As Dr. Dean Mohammed reminded us in his paper, the Muslim worshipper is the abd, the servant or slave. The second element of an ideal prayer, he said, is ubudiyya, the humble acknowledgement of the human condition of depravity, of submission and servitude. Yet, as he noted, there is also an essential element of intimacy open to the believer. The doctrine of loving intimacy, as expounded, for example, by Ahmed al-Ghazali, the brother of the more famous Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, Timothy can tell us about, and other Persian Sufis and poets, presents a rather different view of the divine-human relationship than some of the more common views based on the master-servant relation between God and the believer. In the master-servant relation, the human being is always the servant, and God always the master. One wills and commands while the other is obliged to obey. In the lover-beloved relation, however, the positions of the lover and beloved are not fixed. The love relation is reciprocal. At times, the human being is the lover, while God is the beloved. and at times God is the lover while the creature is God's beloved. Sufis appeal for justification to the words of Surah Al-Ma'idah 54, God loves them and they love him. They've taught that God's love for the human person precedes our love for God, and if it were not for the fact that God had favored humanity by his primordial love, his mercy and compassion, humanity could never have loved God and his creatures. Ultimately, for a Christian, worship must take its tone not just from the sense of service, but also from Jesus' declaration that we are no longer slaves, but friends. We are guests whose feet he will wash, though we are not worthy. We take the tone of our prayer from Paul's insight that we are the adopted daughters and sons of the household, or from Jesus' parable in Luke's gospel that we are prodigals whose confessions of unworthiness are cut short by a Father who wants to embrace us and celebrate our return. It's something we need to be reminded of again and again, since, as George Herbert puts it in his poem, Love Bade Me Welcome, our souls draw back, guilty of dust and sin. We do come into God's presence, but we prefer to remain the shame-faced servants rather than to accept that we are honored guests, worthy to be there. Difficult to accept. When it comes to worship, the Christian can do well to hear again the final lines of that haunting poem. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. Thank you.
We have about, I believe, over 35 minutes. So we are going to take questions.
There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, told of C.S. Lewis, that when he encountered a group of theologians searching for an answer, they turned to Clive and asked him, what is the one defining characteristic of Christianity that none of the other faiths share? And C.S. Lewis said, well, that's easy. It's grace. And Dr. Dagli, you referred to grace and berakah previously. Is there, and if there is, what is the difference between grace and berakah? We as Christians would hold that grace is unmerited, it is unearned, it is God's preceding love for us. Is berakah in essence the same thing? Is it bestowed upon sinners before penitence, or is it a gift in return for the abd relationship?
I think the word grace is used in more than one way. The grace that I was mentioning in my paper, it was in a sense when one talks about graces flowing through the rites, or the grace that sort of exists as a kind of a presence, as opposed to the grace as, in a sense, the metaphysical or theological idea of our in relation to, let's say, our fallen state in a global. So in that sense, barakah wouldn't correspond to that. You'd have to look to other ideas within the Islamic context to correspond to this idea of grace, as the whole question of merit versus not. But in terms of, well, on that question, it's actually a lot closer than people give credit for, sort of realize. There's a very famous hadith of the Prophet, I don't know the exact wording, but the Prophet himself says, none of you will be saved by your actions. And they turned and said, not even you? And he said, not even me, not unless God shelters me with his mercy. So that, I think, corresponds fairly directly to the idea that it's not us who kind of reach out and deserve it in the first place. So I hope that answers your question.
Right. Then I think there is something not very precisely in the things. We have a big philosopher, Lebanese, Porphyrius. He spoke when we open discussing like this. We call it the tree of Porphyrius, because there is some words in the same language in English, sometimes in some it means something, after it can change the meaning. If you can change it, some word using 200 years ago, if you use it now, you don't understand it. Then now you spoke about two things in the sacraments. And you said in Occidental they use sacrament, in Oriental they use mystery. In fact, in Arabic we don't have the difference. We have only one word, is sir. Then last year you heard about one convent opened in the Emirates, in an island. It was destroyed in 750. From 750 till now, we don't have improvement in the Arabic language Christian. And we have one father of the church here from Qatar. He is Isaac the Syriac. There is one book now in French written about this father of the church, Isaac le Syrien. It's not Isaac le Syrien, it's Isaac le Syriac. The Syriac from the church is in the same time. And he spoke about the hesychasm. Then here in Qatar, 1,250 years ago, they spoke about these themes. Then what I want to say about barakah, I am sorry I used the word zakar in the morning. It's the same thing, zikr in Arabic. The zakar is in Hebrew. That's why in the Gregorian University is using zakar. I am sorry, in Arabic is zikr. That's why for us, zikr is making now present and giving life to all these things. And the most important for us is the Eucharist. Then my question for you is what you call it from barakah for you, barakah, what it is for barakah you, because for us, barakah and peace and all these things, they have name. And they are one people, that's why I'm sorry, I will not be long, but only to precise the thing. We have one title of God, or we call God, is philanthrope. Philanthrope is he loves the human being. And we trust and we ask God and we call him, he loved us and we loved him. Then there is a contradiction in what you are saying. I'm sorry, I say contradiction. In between, if the people are not saving by their own things, only by the blessing of God, then I cannot do anything, or God will save us or will not save us. Then there is collaboration between God and between human beings, between our action, our living, our kind of life. That's the prayer. We call God, we answer. God loves us, then we have to answer him with our prayer. Can you please explain these things about barakah in the prayer?
Well, first I just wanted to note that sir is an exact translation of mystery. I mean, it's this. What? No, I know, but my point in saying that was that if you're comparing Islam and Christianity in a Western context, you get a different comparison than if you were to compare Islam and Christianity in the Eastern context. That's all I was saying. Yeah. Yeah. Right, but which corresponds to the word mystery, is what I'm saying. Yeah. Well, in terms of... Yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. In terms of the idea of barakah, all Muslims intuitively, the vast majority, understand that something happens when one performs the rites. They're not just mechanical. And that when you perform them correctly, and when you perform them with the proper intention, something else is happening besides the actual physical actions. You're not, so just beginning from the very beginning, the ablutions. Muslims are always taught, for example, that when one is performing the ablutions with water, something spiritual is also happening. There's a kind of a divine presence that's also or an angelic presence that's accompanying that when it's performed with sincerity, and with the salat, and with the fast, and with everything. There's a kind of, in a sense, the rites, which, because they're instituted by God, channel a kind of light or energy, or, I mean, it's framed in many different ways. And, I mean, it's called many things besides barakah. I mean, I'm saying that because it's a pretty typical way of doing it. People say use other metaphors or different ways of speaking about it. But the idea is that there's something invisible corresponding to the visible, and that it's also, it's instituted by God, and that's why I was making the commonality between the way the de facto understanding of a Muslim as he or she performs prayer, and the understanding of what a sacrament or a mystery is in the Christian context. You see that there are those three similarities of the visible form, the invisible, whatever you want to call it, presence or grace or barakah, and the fact that it's ordained, it's considered to be ordained within each tradition by God. And and that barakah it is itself transformative. That is to say, it's not just something that, it doesn't just sort of happen and hang in the air for no reason. The barakah itself acts on the soul and transforms the soul and purifies the heart. So I'll stop there, yeah.
When I speak to Muslims about Christianity and about Christian, when they ask me, I do not attempt to explain away the concept or the creed of Jesus being the Son of God or the Trinity. We don't need to do that, because if I do this to Muslims, they actually wouldn't believe me. To say 3 in 1 is just strange to their thinking. So we need not do this. I say to them that the Quran knew that, or God says in the Quran, that these people were worshipping 3, or some were saying God is 3, and yet He has given them a special status. He has given them a special status. And He said, don't argue or dialogue with them except in the most courteous manner. And has allowed a Muslim to marry a woman, a Christian woman, who remains Christian. And think of this situation. Here is a man, a Muslim man, marrying a woman, his wife, who remains a Christian with all her beliefs as Christians, to be his wife and the mother of his children. And they accept each other like that. I don't think we will need to get closer to each other than a husband to a wife in order to accept each other as we are, all with our own respective beliefs.
So I have a gender question. Don't be afraid, though. What about Mary, the mother of Jesus? She's been mentioned a number of times here. And you made me think when you mentioned, Daniel, the Tese Magnificat, the Song of Mary, which is actually the Song of Hannah, too. Might Mary, the mother of Jesus, be a bridge? Especially if you think of the whole Annunciation passage in Luke, and where she says, I am the Lord's servant, doulos totiu.
Sometimes I think there is slightly a too easy parallel drawn between the Mary of the Quran and the Mary of the Gospels. Sometimes I say, when I want to risk it, I say that in many respects Mary's role in Christianity is parallel to Muhammad's role in Islam. That is to say, as the human channel through which the word enters the world. I think to try and draw a parallel between the Mary of the Quran and the Mary of the Gospels risks losing something of the uniqueness of the relationship between the two traditions. To see that, not in all respects, but in some very specific and particular respects, Mary plays the role in Christianity that the Prophet plays in Islam, because and that the doctrine of her virginity in Christianity functions in a similar way to the doctrine of the illiteracy of the Prophet. That is to say, as an evidence that what comes from either of them is of God and not of their own creation. So I think there are a number of situations like that where you get these parallel characters in Quran and Gospel, and they're not always helpful parallels, because they tend to they risk reductionism. But if we focus on them carefully and think more broadly outside the normal sort of structure in which we line up religions against one another, then they do offer us insights. Yes, and I think that's a key one for Muslims to understand, that for Christians Jesus is the Word. He's not. We don't understand Jesus simply as the bringer of the Word. He's not the bringer of the gospel. He's the message, not the messenger. So that calls into question, I guess, the way Islam sees Christianity, and throws up another question. And it helps Christians also to understand a bit more why Muslims treat the Quran the way they do. If for Muslims the Quran is as much the word of God as Jesus is the word of God for Christians, then we can very well understand why they treat it differently from the way we might treat the Gospels. I don't know whether that answers your question.
I was wondering this kind of role of Jesus in the spiritual cosmology, especially in Sufism. Perhaps there can be some sort of, light shed on how the esoteric sort of kind of interpretation of Jesus as the seal of the saints, in some traditions. I was wondering if you would comment on that.
Within Sufism, there's definitely certain expositions of what the reality of a prophet is, which provide some measure of you might say cosmic importance and to the prophets that you might not find in someone who would, let's say, conceive of the prophet as merely an exemplar. So let's say in one extreme you have the idea of the Prophet Muhammad, if I could just speak about that for a second, as sort of being an exemplar. But then you have other ideas of the prophet as being the actual source or the channel of this barakah, or the source or channel of a kind of spiritual energy that flows into the heart of the believer. And beyond that, and even in other kinds of metaphysical speculations that you have, in not speculations but in other metaphysical doctrines, you have the doctrine of, for example, the al-haqiqat al-Muhammadiyya, the Muhammadan reality, or the idea of the perfect man. These doctrines, they're not equivalent to the visions of Christ within Christianity. But as it were, there's a trajectory there as you move closer and closer to some of these more esoteric explanations of the reality of what the prophet is, which have a little bit more overlap with some descriptions of Christ in the Christian tradition. And the same would go for any prophet. Now, I don't want to overstate that and say that for Sufis, the Prophet Muhammad has the same function and role as Christ does for Christians. I mean, these two things don't become equivalent. But in terms of what you might call the cosmic spiritual function of the prophet, and by extension, the other prophets, there is a little bit more commonality. There's a way in which, for example, a Muslim could understand the role of Christ in the spiritual life of a Christian, that would give some kind of insight, even though the two realities don't boil down to being the same thing. Does that sort of get to your question? Oh, well, many people, they speak of Jesus as being the prophet of the inward, as the exemplar of a certain mode of spirituality, or a certain kind of spirituality that's focused on asceticism and sacrifice and so forth. And it's very also actually the spirituality connected with both Jesus and his mother as framed within the Islamic tradition. Within Sufism, it has a very significant role. For example, you can read in Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, his chapter devoted to the wisdom or the light of Jesus. And there are, according to his kind of spiritual anthropology, there are certain Sufis or certain practitioners of the spiritual life who are following, as it were, following in the footsteps of Jesus. Which is to say that if you look at if you look at Sufis as a whole, some of them are, as it were, following in the footsteps of Jesus. Some of them are, as it were, following in the footsteps of other prophets. That is to say, there's a kind of an identification, a kind of a sympathetic relationship between the kind of spirituality that Christ embodied and the kind of spirituality that informs their life. So there is a concrete connection in that sense. Or there can be. But in the overall, you might say, solar system for Muslims, the prophet is always the sun, and then the other prophets are always stars within that solar system, and that would also include Christ. But they're also, as it were, stars that can be followed.
Hello, it's Timothy Giannotti from Toronto. I just wanted to stop and highlight a few points of I think not necessarily profound parallel or connectivity, but just a few points that have given me cause to stop and ponder. One of the points, and I'm very grateful to Daniel for making this, is this idea that the word given to us is the point of contact. And I'm just pondering now the role of the primacy of God's word, really, in both of our traditions. And without venturing right now to make any direct parallels or comparisons, I think this is it's a very profound point. This idea that it is a word coming forth from God as a sign of God's love, as a sign of God's mercy, as a sign of God's unfathomable esteem for us, right? That this gift of a word and this point of contact is given to us. And this is something that resonates very powerfully for Muslims as it does for Christians, I think. I also wanted to ponder this notion of the sacramentality of Islamic practice. I think this again is a very, I'm not sure if it's a complete parallel, but I think it's a very rich thing to ponder. And one of the things that Ahmad's brother Abu Hamid talks about is, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali talks about the fact that every posture in the practice is imbued with these secrets, with the asrar. And one does not necessarily need to be aware of the secrets in order to benefit from them. And so I'm thinking of the very similar way that people have faith in the sacrament without knowing what the sacrament is actually doing to or for them, but this absolute confidence that there is something within the sacrament that is something the sacrament is doing to them and for them that they can't begin to imagine. And as we ponder that, I also am struck by something Abu Hamid al-Ghazali says about the practice. And this is something I have a question for Daniel and for the other Christian theologians in the room. And that is that al-Ghazali says that not only are the practices, the postures themselves filled with secrets, but there is a kind of epistemology that is connected to the physical practices. That is, that engaging in the practice itself opens up avenues for knowledge that would otherwise remain closed. And so he says that sometimes the practice itself is the path to what he calls kashf, or unveiling, the unveiling of the mysteries. And I'm just wondering if there's any similar discussion within the Christian consideration and meditation upon the sacraments that would resonate with that. This notion that within the sacraments there are epistemological pathways that open up that would otherwise remain closed and unavailable.
Yes. Epistemological, not perhaps in the sense of simply knowing some information. The Christian sacraments are very much related to the life of Christ and his ministry. Baptism, the healing of the sick, the anointing of the sick, reconciliation, marriage, etc. The point being that I think the participation in the sacraments is part of the conforming of one's life to the shape of his life. We are conformed, we say we are baptized into his death in order to rise with him. I mean, baptism means drowning, literally. If it's an epistemology, it's not simply an epistemology, which is, Michael Welzer can help us out here, but it's not simply an epistemology about information. It's about the shape my life takes in conforming my life to the life of Christ, and the way that places me in the world and the way it places me in relationship to God. Michael, do you want to help me out there? Behind you.
We had a very strong ecumenical consensus in the Lima liturgy that in the sacraments we have a three-step approach. So first you have the gratitude, the thanksgiving for the gifts of creation, bread and wine. Not just gifts of nature, but nature and culture interacting. Yeah? So you have to have already a lot of working of the Spirit to get only a piece of bread and a jug of wine in the middle of the community. But so some people then thought, oh, this is it. It's a wonderful community meal. Yeah? He said, no, it's only one step. The second step is the night of betrayal and the cross and the experience that the good gifts of creation are misused by us. Yeah? And not only that we are not only in danger from the outside, but from the inside. So the disciples forsake Christ, and one betrays him, and so on and so on. So the night of betrayal, it's the second step, and then the memorial of Christ comes in, and then the third step, that God rescues us, not only by putting us back on track, but by ennobling us, lifting us up, and here the work of the Spirit is particularly. In all three dimensions, the whole divinity is active, but the whole story that we are celebrating and enacting has these different dimensions. And going back to the Trinity, I think the main issue is, how do we understand revelation in our traditions? And the Christians, it's not one and one and one, I think, the three figure. It's revelation. How can God reach out to creation and at the same time keep the divinity? As soon as God enters creation, why don't we confuse God and earthly things? Yeah, I think this is in the endeavor where we would have to exchange more deeply. How do you think revelation without thinking differentiation in the one God? So we believe in the one God, but we think it's not a simplistic oneness, it is a differentiated oneness in order to understand the revelation of the divine. And the sacraments is enacted, as you say, physically permeated encounter with the sacred, the secrets, the mysteries of the divine.
Add something that, seeing as we got back to the Trinity, the image you used, Jana, of the chord, not just 10 separate notes with each with a particular sound. Philip Sheldrake will be able to tell us precisely which paragraph of the exercises it comes in, but or the autobiography. But Ignatius had one of his visions. He was no Julian of Norwich or Teresa of Avila, and he didn't have the ability really to describe his mystical experience. But one of the experiences he speaks about is having an insight into the Trinity as three notes, as it were, to accord. So the experience was of a unity, it wasn't of three separate things. And I think a point that Archbishop Rowan made either this morning or last evening about the sense of the Trinity growing out of prayer. It's not that we have this doctrine which we have to move around a chessboard, and then when we actually get to the level of prayer, then we somehow it resolves itself into a unity. But the thing which actually pushed us towards formulating this was what was happening in prayer. And, one can argue that it gets a bit complicated once you get into starting to do hypostases and various other substances and various other things. The work of Richard Borkham I always find very interesting, where he talks about the earliest level of Jewish Christianity, which he sees in the New Testament evidence, that somehow the question was about, if you ask who is God, somehow you cannot answer that question without including Jesus. The question of identity, the identity of God and the identity of the God one is relating to in prayer, somehow, they don't know how, includes Jesus before one can do all these distinctions and divisions. So I think it does grow out of an organic thing, and your image of the chord is a very good one, because it does actually function together.
Here we are between a paradise and hell, between fire and a garden. So we cannot avoid contradiction, if not by trying to reconcile them. And it comes to my mind when Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, a woman, a Sufi woman, was carrying two pots. One was water and the other was fire, as carbon, burning carbon. And they asked her, "Where are you going?" She said, "I'm going to the hell to throw water on it, on the fire there, and to the paradise to inflame it with the love of God." But I don't know if the hadith which said, "Al-khalqu kulluhum عيال وَحَبُّهُمْ إِلَى اللَّهِ أَنْفَعُهُمْ إِلَى عِيَالِهِ" can help a Muslim believer to understand what we Christians mean by saying father or even mother, as the quotation of the Prophet Isaiah and Dan Madigan now mentioned. So my question to you, what do you think about this hadith and about the invocation father in Christianity? Al-khalqu kulluhum عيال. I don't know how to translate عيال because all mankind are dependent. It's well, nice try, but it's not the same as عيال, because عيال is the same root. عيال is the same root of عائلة, which is family. So children, okay, I agree with you, but it's when you say العيال كبرت in your Egyptian dialect, you mean your sons. So when we said we are عيال or children of God, I don't know if you have something about to say. Thank you.
Well, even let's suppose it just literally means the children of God. I mean, just set aside the sort of etymological dispute that seemed to have erupted just now. A theologian like who I mentioned before, Razi, he would have no problem with it. It's if I mean, for example, you have human beings referred to as God's slaves. I mean, the Lord, the master-slave relationship is a human relationship. It's all bound up with materiality and the physical body and so forth and so on. The relationship of king and subject, same thing. Now, the problem is not the imagery of parent-child for Muslim theologians. The issue with them is the limitation. That is to say that Jesus was, in some sense, the exclusive begotten Son of God. That's where the Islamic theology sort of says you can't go that far. But if you were to say in some sense that God is our Father, in the sense that God is prior, God loves us, God is our authority figure, and so forth and so on in that sense, then, you know, many, even, I mean, Razi, he's as Asharite a theologian as you can get. I mean, even he accepts that. It's the special way in which Christ is described as God incarnate and as also the begotten Son of God, not created, the uncreated Son of God. That's where for him it stops being a metaphor and becomes something that, from the Islamic point of view, becomes unacceptable because of what it entails.
We have time, I think, for a last question.
Thomas from Paris, you will recognize the accent. Just the common point, as far as I know, is in Exodus, when Moses, because it has been quoted as one of the 5 prophets, a very important prophet. So Moses, if I quote, when he moved to, when he have sent to Egypt to set free the people, he said, "From whom I will come to in front of the Pharaoh." And God told him it was the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. And he said, "I am what I am." So far we are in a monotheist period of times. So that's a common ground with the Christians. But then I have been very impressed with Mr. Dagli about his knowledge of the gospel, so Çok Güzel. But where can we find in the gospel the word Trinity? Because if we go back on the example of the prayer, it said, "Make your name be sanctified." So where can we find the Trinity? Because it could be the point of big difference.
I mean, obviously the word, the locution Trinity doesn't appear in the Bible. I mean, it's the issue is not it's not a question over you know, whether that particular idea is expressed in that particular form as such. What I was trying to get at, and I hope it came through, is that what I was really trying to restrict myself as carefully as possible to simply what the Muslim, as it were, what a Muslim sees, as it were, through the Quran when he or she is looking upon the Christian tradition. And I mean, I'm well aware that that the Trinity and Christology and the Incarnate has been the subject of very refined, exalted, and profound meditations in the Christian tradition, and which neither stand nor fall on whether or not you can find the word Trinity in the Gospel. But so I was trying to limit my remarks to the idea of how does it strike a Muslim? What's the impression that a Muslim gets when he thinks about what prayer means, and what he sees that the Quran says about Christians when they're praying, and then at the same time what the Quran says about the teachings, as it were, that what Christians say about God, and what a Muslim sees Christians saying about God, and how that encounter can be sorted out. And you know, my feeling is that it's really very important and very far from trivial to be able to at least sort out and to have this kind of conceptual separation between Christians as human beings praying to God on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Christians as human beings providing metaphysical speculation about the nature of God. And these two are obviously very interrelated. And I mean, it was only 30 minutes. I mean, you could barely even scratch the surface on something like that. They're very interrelated, but they're also not, like I said in the talk, they're not identical. And I think what the Quran is doing is saying, this is my view. The Quran is saying God accepts Christians, but with these, as it were, qualifications, or as it were, with these provisos. You know, I mean, if I can put it in a very, I don't mean to be vulgar about it, but as it were, it's as though the Quran is saying we can put up with the doctrines because of the devotional life of Christians. I mean, in other words, you don't wash your hands of the Christian religion because of these things, and yet at the same time you have to be very specific about what aspects of those teachings are considered unacceptable from the Quranic point of view. That was my limited focus.
All right, we are going to thank our speakers. And I've been asked to inform you that the books recording the first 6 Building Bridges seminars are on sale outside in the atrium. Your Grace, would you like to come to give the conclusive words, please?
Thank you very much. After the great intellectual and spiritual nourishment of the day, it's a little difficult to boil things down into 5 minutes at the end. But I have 5 words which I've picked up from today's discussions, and I'll try not to speak for more than 1 minute per word. The first word is friendship. The point was made this morning that our common ancestor in faith, Abraham, is called God's friend, and that there is in all our reflection about prayer a crucial and central element of thinking what it is to be a friend of God. A friend, in the text from the Gospel of John that was also referred to today, a friend being someone who knows or understands what is going on, as opposed to the slave who does not know what the master is doing or what the master really wants. Friendship, then, is a good place to begin. Friendship with God, not to mention friendship with one another. But friendship has something very closely connected with my second word, which is knowledge. Prayer is a way of knowing God, because if prayer is rooted in friendship with God, then of course prayer is about knowledge. But knowledge as sharing, absorption, not an acquisitive knowledge, a knowledge that seeks to pile up intellectual property. I welcomed very much the question about whether there is an epistemology of the physical in prayer. I think the answer is clearly, as Dan said, that there is. You learn something simply by going through the physical motions of celebrating Holy Week as a Christian. And it was the late and very great Metropolitan Antony of Surozh, the great Russian Orthodox teacher, who said, "You begin to understand orthodoxy in your legs." Anyone who's been to Orthodox services will know exactly what that is about. Knowledge as participation, knowledge as sharing, not acquisitive. And perhaps that may just allow us to understand a little better one other question that came this morning in the response from Dr. Din Muhammad about modernity and Puritanism. Modernity and modern religious Puritanism or fundamentalism are not the same thing, but what they do have in common is an impatience with traditional means of knowledge. Both have a view of knowledge which is essentially about accumulating or acquiring, rather than participating or absorbing. And prayerful knowing, I would say, sets itself both against modern consumerist culture and against a false and impatient primitivist religion which seeks for quick answers with which to reproach other people. But to speak of knowledge in this non-acquisitive way takes us back to another word that was mentioned this morning as a possible area of tension or disagreement between us, and I'm not sure that it is, and that's the word desire, which is my third word. Reza quoted the wonderful threefold typology of prayer from Imam Ali, beginning with desire, the prayer of the merchant. There are very similar texts in Christianity which talk about the mercantile attitude to prayer. But this clearly is about a desire that is precisely acquisitive. It's a desire that wants to gain a particular goal for the self. Whereas one of the fascinating features, I think, of Christian reflection on prayer, and I'd be very interested to see what corresponds to this in the Islamic world, is a fresh account of desire, which sees it as more and more letting go of the acquisitive, the selfish, more and more simply the opening up to what is to be given. That is naked desire, not for anything in particular, any goal in particular, any future in particular, but sheer openness to the real, to the true, and therefore a desire which always expands and is never fulfilled, never met, a constant, undying thirst for the real, the true, the divine. And it's at that level, I think, that there is a convergence between what we've heard from Islamic sources, what we find in Christianity, and what we find also in the Buddhist critique of craving. To grow spiritually for the Buddhist is to grow beyond desire in the sense of craving, and yet it is still a radical nakedness or openness to what is true or what is real. My fourth word is protest. Desire, in the sense that I've mentioned, means, I've said, openness. Openness means trust, an absolute confidence that when you have opened your heart, your soul, your selfhood, your body to God, God honors his promise to be there for and with you. And if God honors his promise, is it then possible to think of having the confidence simply to let the words of protest, doubt, trouble rise to the surface of the mind because we trust that God can absorb them? It's not that Jewish or Christian prayer, the Psalms or the writings of Martin Luther or whatever, it's not that they rebel against the idea of submission to God. I'd much rather say that they see submission as something which can be a process. And in that process, we may need to find the words of discontent, of bewilderment, of anger, and allow them to arise in order that our submission may be the more full. George Herbert perhaps deserves one fourth reference today, and that is his great poem, The Collar, which begins with an outspoken cry of protest against God. I struck the board and cried, no more. The poet begins by saying, I will have no more to do with God. And through the poem, he explains why he is disillusioned, angry with God, the God who he feels has let him down. And at the end of the poem comes the perfect resolution of submission. As I raged and grew more fierce and wild, with every word, methought I heard one calling, child. And I replied, my Lord. Submission is there, but it is a submission that is achieved. It has taken time. And perhaps that has just a little bit to do with my fifth word, which is unity. Unity, we've discovered today, is a very complex notion. We've looked at it from a number of points of view. We began with some very profound reflections from Reza on Tawhid as the fundamental category in which you understand prayer and everything else. And precisely because of its fundamental nature, we were reminded that to speak of the unity of God is never to speak of the unity of one thing. God is not one as an object is one, with an edge around it. God's oneness is different. And that may mean that in the process of time, the achieving of unity with God, we have to ask some very complex questions. What is our unity with God? What is the unity we seek? Certainly not to be one thing with God. That is literally not thinkable. It would not make sense to think of us being one thing with God, not only because we are created and God is not, but also because God is not a thing, as we've said. So what is the nature of that unity that we move into or grow into? Neither the unity of one thing, nor simply a unity of, as it might be said, distant agreement or consonance, as it were. We wave to one another across the distances of the cosmos and agree that we have basically the same ideas, God and ourselves. It has to be more than that, and it has to be different from being one thing. And if I can heroically resist the temptation to respond at length to what Johnna was saying about the doctrine of the Trinity and the nature of fatherhood, I think some of what Christians would want to say in this connection is that we are looking in our language about the Trinity for a way of speaking of divine unity, which is neither the unity of one thing nor simply a unity of agreement, but has an ontology to it, which our words will always fall short of, but which remind us that we have to say more than anything else we would ever say about any other sort of unity, which is why in one of the great classics of Christian mysticism we read that God is not one and he is not three, relativizing all the concepts of number that we might want to bring to that question. So in today's discussions, I think we've been taken very deep. We've had some excellent questions from the floor, as well as some excellent papers to stimulate our thinking and our praying. And in concluding today, I want, on my own behalf, to express the warmest possible thanks to our speakers today, but also to all of you who have come to participate in the discussion, who have given your time and energy and attention very generously today and have contributed so greatly to the common understanding which we seek in this seminar. Thank you all very much.